but you don't talk about the things you agree about. And what gets into the press, what's newsworthy, are the disagreements and not the agreements. And where are the disagreements? On those parts of the discipline that are least well developed and that you know least about. You find exactly the same thing in other disciplines. Whenever values enter in, something different happens. I have often had young people who have wanted to devote their life to promoting what they thought were the right policies. And I have always advised them, look, that's all right as an avocation, but don't do that as your vocation. You get to do something and earn your living on something which you enjoy doing, but which is non-ideological and non-policy oriented, and then do the rest as a sideline. Because if you once start going along the other line, sooner or later you're going to lose your sense of objectivity. You're very much dependent on the kind of sources of income that you don't want to become dependent on. Because you will find that you have special interests who will support you as long as your ideological preconception meets their special interest. But they won't have anything to do with you if it doesn't. And therefore, if you try to make your living that way, you're always having to come up against a situation where you have to decide whether you're going to sacrifice your principles in order to be able to get the money you need in order to achieve something else. People don't realize how hard it is to have truly free speech. Very few people in the United States are in a position where they can express what they really believe freely and without inhibition. Because if one way or another the ideas they express are going to offend some source of income for their firm, they're in trouble. I can give you some very simple examples. Here, during the 1950s and since, the U.S. has been issuing savings bonds. There's been a great deal of propaganda to buy savings bonds. You paid $100 for a savings bond, you got 3 or 4% interest, but the inflation rate was 5 or 6 or 7%. When you got back the $125, $150 at the end of the period, it would buy less than the $100 did at the beginning. At that time, I talked to many bankers, and I said, tell me, do you buy savings bonds for yourself? Of course not. Do you really consider them a good investment? No, they're a terrible investment. Why do you put these brochures in your slips? Oh, because the Treasury wouldn't like it if we didn't. 9 out of 10 of those people knew that they were giving very bad advice. And they were all doing it because it was very important for them to be in the good graces of the Treasury or whoever else. Let me give you a very different example that had nothing to do with wartime at all. We're heading towards socialized medicine. You're a professor in a medical school. Your medical school is receiving 2/3 of its income from the U.S. government. You believe that you ought to have strictly private medicine. Would it be easy for you to get up and say that? Not at all. It would be very, very difficult. I've often said that the only people who have real honest-to-God freedom of speech are tenured professors on the verge of retirement, or who have already retired and have an independent income, like myself. But I think one of the most precious things in life is to be able to say what you believe freely and openly without having to worry too much about the consequences. I say too much. I don't believe that it ought to be costless. If you're going to say unpopular things and you're going to become unpopular as a result, that's going to impose a cost. And sometimes maybe you won't be willing to bear it. But there ought to be no, so to speak, artificial costs or artificial limitations on you. But yet there are on most people. I could give one example after another of the same kind of thing. Right now, you have this terrible situation that's happening in college after college in this country of a complete intolerance for speech which is not, quote, politically correct. It's come to be a new term that's used, politically correct speech. It's a terrible term. It's a disgraceful term. Correct speech ought to be speech which expresses what a person believes, what he thinks to be the truth. And it's a disgrace that in universities of all places, there should be the kind of censorship that is in fact being imposed. Most important of all, what's important is not only freedom to speak, but freedom to listen. I don't think freedom to speak includes being subsidized by anybody. I don't believe it includes freedom to use government facilities like a hall to give a speech. What it includes is, on the one hand, the right to hire a hall, to say what you want, and second, and most important, not for the speaker, but for everybody else, the right of everybody else to listen, to hear what they want to hear. And what's happening now is not so much restriction on freedom of speech, but a restriction on freedom to listen. If a professor says something in a course that other people don't like, they come in and disrupt the course so that nobody can listen to him. The people who want to hear him can't hear him. And I think that's absolutely disgraceful. In fact, I think the most important single virtue, human virtue, is tolerance. And tolerance grows out of humility. So the source of tolerance is the recognition that we may have very strong feelings, we may have very strong beliefs, but there is a chance I may be wrong, because the other fellow also thinks he's right. So I ought to be free to try to persuade him of my view. He ought to be free to persuade me of his view. But neither of us have the right to coerce the other through physical intimidation.